Steve Boucher had no idea that it had any experience with aliens until 1981 when he bought a book by Bud Hopkins called Missing Time. As he read, he started to get flashes of memory of similar events described in the book. One memory was of his father and himself in the car as they were driving home. Steve was 4 years old and sitting in the back seat of the car. Steve liked to climb into the back shelf and look out the window at the stars. He noticed that one of the stars was moving. It then started growing in size until he realized it was coming towards them. He climbed down off the shelf and into the front seat and asked his father about the lights and then pointed at the window. The light was now following them at treetop level and was matching their speed. When his father saw the light, he started to panic and drove faster, trying to outrun it. When Steve asked what it was, he said, "Shut up, leave me alone." He'd never spoken to him like that before. His father was visibly frightened, and Steve couldn't understand why. The ship then landed on the road in front of them, and his father had to stop. When it landed, it lit up the trees and the road, and everything was extremely bright. As they were watching it, two grey beings got out and stood in front of the ship and looked directly at them. His father had managed to regain his composure and told him to stay down and whatever happens, stay low so they don't see you. He said, "I'm going to find out what they want and under no circumstances get out of the car." As he got out, Steve peeked over the dashboard and saw him walking towards the two beings. One of the beings walked up to him, and his father used his body to block the being's view so he couldn't see Steve in the car. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit like. It really helps to keep the channel growing. And if you're new here, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest videos. We've got lots of strange and fascinating stories coming up, and we'd love to have you along for the journey. Steve was feeling bored and tried to see who the beings were. Although they looked different, he thought that maybe he might know them and was curious. Disobeying his father, he got out of the car and walked towards him. His father heard Steve get out and put his hand behind his back and waved his hand at him, motioning him to get back. Steve was too curious and came up behind him, and all of a sudden, the being he was talking to looked over his shoulder and looked directly at Steve, and then looked at his father. He said, "You seem to be concerned about the child." He could hear his voice in his head, and his father said, "Yeah, that's my boy." And he turned around to him and said, "I told you to stay in the car. Now go back and wait for me." He said, "Would you like my crew member to take him back to the vehicle for you?" And his father said, "No, that's okay. We have to go because my wife's waiting at home." However, the other being came over to Steve and took him by the hand and walked him back to the car. Steve turned around and saw his father standing in the road staring at them with a horrified look on his face. The being took Steve back to the car and got him beside him and sat in the driver's seat. Steve could see his father talking with the other being, and then they went inside the ship. The being then put his hands on the steering wheel and said, "What does this do?" And Steve told him that it makes the car go this way or that way, whichever way you turn it. Then said, "What do these do?" And he pointed to the pedals on the floor, and Steve said, "One makes the car go, the other one makes it stop." He then pointed to the dashboard at the radio and said, "What is that?" Steve said to the being, "That's a radio where you can hear music and hear people talking." He said, "Can you talk back to them?" And Steve said, "No, it doesn't work that way." The alien kept him company whilst his father was on board the ship. The being was basically babysitting him while his father was having an abduction experience. He asked Steve what he did during the day and added, "Do you go to school?" Steve said, "No, that's next year." Then Steve saw his father and the other being come back out as they stood in the road talking. The being next to him then looked at the other being and then looked at Steve and said, "I have to go now." Then Steve said, "Can't you stay a little bit longer?" because he was enjoying his company and was keeping him entertained. He then looked at the being, and the other being nodded his head and said, "I do have to go and get out." His father got back in the car as the two beings went inside the ship. They watched the ship lift off before moving slowly over the trees. His father started the car and seemed very quiet. It didn't say anything as they headed home. A short while later, the aliens came back and again landed in front of them, forcing them to stop. His father muttered, "Oh, what the hell do they want now?" One being got out this time and came over to the car and motioned for his father to lower the window. His father said, "What is it?" And the being said, "You forgot these," and he handed him his glasses. His father thanked him and he walked back to the ship. They saw the ship leave again, and that was the end of the experience. Many years later, Steve asked his father whether he'd remembered the episode. He said he remembered putting his hands behind his back and waving for him to get back in the car, but hadn't remembered them returning his glasses. They both realized that it wasn't a dream, and it wasn't their imagination, and was an actual event that they'd shared. Steve then asked his father what had happened to him inside the craft. He said that they showed him some visions in his mind, where he could see all these different inventions throughout history, like a museum of technology, where he could see these different machines and inventions from the past and right up to the future. Steve then described the alien that was in the car with him. His face was a different shade of grey, but it was his eyes that got his attention. He discovered he could hear him when he looked at his eyes. They communicate through the eyes and not vocally. He didn't think his jaw moved and thinks it was fastened to the skull. His uniform was dark blue and skin tight. He hadn't noticed his feet, but his hands had 3 long fingers and a thumb that were longer than ours. Their skin looked like a dolphin's skin. When he looked at their eyes, he hadn't noticed whether they'd actually blinked, but didn't think they did, and they were completely bald. At 17, Steve played in a band and played at the American Hotel in Niagara Falls, Ontario, and then at a house party in Vineland, Ontario. They then intended to drive home to St. Catharines, Ontario. At around 3 a.m, they arrived at the entrance to the Queen Elizabeth Highway and decided to take the North Service Road, which followed the coast of Lake Ontario. As they were talking, the driver abruptly stopped the car and said, "You better look at this because you're not going to believe me." Ahead of them, in a parking lot of a restaurant, was a saucer-shaped craft sitting on the ground. It had portals around it and a row of red lights around the perimeter. At the bottom of the craft were little searchlights that panned back and forth over the pavement. They were far enough away not to feel threatened and figured it may have been a movie prop. However, none of them wanted to pass the object and decided to turn around and take the back road to St. Catharines. As he started to move, he found the car wouldn't turn. His hands were on the steering wheel, but he couldn't turn. But it then started to move towards the object. He stepped on the brake, but nothing happened. They were now moving quickly towards this thing and were bracing for impact, fearing they were going to hit it. Everybody in the van was panicking and yelling. When they were about 30 feet away, the car stalled and he couldn't start it. Everybody went quiet and figured they would leave them alone if they stayed quiet and did not move, and ensured all the doors were locked. The drummer said, "They're getting out," and said, "They look like little guys." They weren't sure whether they were going to attack them. Steve grabbed hold of the microphone stand in case they got in, and he needed something to defend himself with. The beings tried the doors, and one of them went to the window on the driver's side before trying the back door. A young man they'd given a lift to looked around at them and opened the back door. Shocked at what it'd done, the door flew open and there were these 3 beings standing in line, and the one in front, who Steve believed was the leader, came into the van and was able to stand because he was so short. He looked around and before anyone realized, they found they were paralyzed. He said, "I'm sorry, but I had to temporarily paralyze you because you were thinking violent thoughts, and I was concerned for my safety and the safety of my crew. That we mean you no harm, and I'm on a peaceful mission. We want to do some tests on some of you, and won't keep you long. Then we'll bring you back, and you can be on your way." I needed 3 people, and he looked at the bass player and said, "You." Then he looked at the hitchhiker and said, "You," before turning to Steve. When his eyes focused on Steve, Steve looked to the floor of the van because he didn't want to look at the being's eyes because that's how he could hear him. The tension became so strong that Steve couldn't resist it, and he slowly looked up at him. As soon as they made eye contact, he said, "And you." He told them to follow him, and as he moved out of the van, His foot got caught in the snare drum stand and the drum fell over and rolled out onto the parking lot. One of the other beings picked it up and started examining it. As Steve got out, he came face to face with the being holding the drum, and as they made eye contact, this thought came into his head where he said, "Man, are you ugly?" The being immediately turned his head away so he couldn't see his face. Then Steve thought, was that me thinking about him, or was that him thinking about me, because it appeared that their minds were connected. They were lined up along the side of the van, where they said, "We're going on board this ship. It may seem strange, but don't look to the left or the right, just keep looking straight ahead, and when we're on the ship, don't touch the hull." They then lifted off the ground and started moving towards the ship. It was a strange feeling, because they were not moving their legs and were suspended. Steve got curious and turned his head to the left for a split second, and then immediately stopped. When he looked straight ahead, they continued moving. He then quickly turned to the right, and they stopped again, and then, when he looked forward, they kept on moving. He never did it again. As they approached the ship, they turned on a 90-degree angle towards the doorway, and saw what looked like corrugated metal stairs with some kind of railing. They didn't walk up the stairs, but floated up on an angle where the door of the ship was arched. It was obviously made for the short aliens and not a taller person. Steve briefly stuck his hand out and lightly touched the surface of the craft with his ring finger of his left hand, because he wanted to see what it felt like. It felt warm and was like aluminium. Strangely, about 2 weeks later, he got a huge wart on that finger, which took him weeks to get rid of. The whole event took place in 1971, and the memory of this particular incident didn't come out until Steve went to Manhattan to undergo hypnotic regression with Dr. Aphrodite Claymore, who worked with Bud Hopkins on his book titled Missing Time. Dr. Claymore had 2 sessions with Steve, which is when the van incident came out. He was asked about the short aliens and whether they were male or female. Steve felt that they were all male. He also felt that when he was talking to them, that there was a soul, and were not robots, that they weren't much different than we were, and were just in a different form of body, and then even with their eyes he was able to see that there's life there. The ships were saucer-shaped, and the inside had furniture that was very plain. Where he was expecting to see walls of electronic equipment with lights and screens, it felt more like a military barracks, where the aliens were like soldiers that operated under a chain of command. Once inside, they were separated from each other, where Steve got the leader, who took him to a curved bench that followed the contours of the ship. He asked him to remove his clothing and place them on the floor because they needed to do tests. The other guys also started to take their clothes off. Steve undressed but kept his underwear on and said to the being, "Can I keep my underwear?" And he said, "What is underwear?" He didn't understand the word, so he showed him. He said, "Yes, you can keep them on." It then took him over to another part of the ship where there was a cabinet that was curved that followed the contour of the ship. There was a countertop, and he asked Steve to climb on it. As he was sitting there, he could see that the being had a metal table with something in a towel that he started to unroll, and saw what looked like surgical or dental instruments. Steve thought, "I've got to get something from this ship because no one's going to believe me when I tell them." He found a knob on one of the drawers on a cabinet, which he unscrewed and held. When the leader came back to him, he said, "We're going to do the test." He then said, "What have you got? Have you taken something?" Steve realized that you can't hide anything from them because they always know what you're thinking. Steve then opened his hand and showed him the knob, and he looked at it, and then he looked at Steve and said, "You can't keep this." The other being near the table said, "Why not let him keep it? What harm can it do?" He looked at the other being and said, "We're not supposed to let them keep anything." The leader took the knob from Steve. Steve was then asked to sit on a metal gurney, like you see in a hospital, before wheeling him over to the other being with the instruments. He then picked up an instrument which looked like a hand unit for a phone and said, "I'll show you how this works," then turned it on and held out his arm. It showed a green light on his arm, and wherever the beam from this being hit his arm, Steve could see his skeletal structure under the skin. Steve then held out his arm, and the being turned on the light. Steve was amazed that when he put it on his arm, he not only saw his bones, but could see his muscles, veins, arteries, and nerves. He could see everything in his arm as well as the pulsing of his heartbeat. He said, "Would like to look at your stomach." They then looked inside the stomach and body. There was a big round light above him with round bulbs that started pulsing from the outside to the inside, and he said, "It's very important that you look right into the center of it." As Steve was looking, he suddenly blacked out, and when he came to, the being was rolling up the instruments in the towel. The leader then said he could get dressed. Meanwhile, the drummer was refusing to cooperate and just stood at the entrance to the ship that just tried to get him to remove his clothing. Steve had no fear of them and didn't believe that they were going to harm them, so there was no reason for them to run away. After getting dressed, the leader and the person with the instruments and towel came over and said, "If there's any questions you'd like to ask us now, it's the time because we have a few minutes." They were asked where they were from, so the beings walked over to a star map on the wall and pointed to a group of stars, which turned out to be Orion. He was asked whether they had any bases on Earth, and the leader said, "Yes, we have several bases on Earth," and said, "There's one right here," and he pointed towards Lake Ontario. Steve asked, "What is the true religion on Earth?" And they both looked at each other, and they looked back at Steve, and the leader said, "Why would you ask a question like that?" Steve said, "Because you're obviously a lot more advanced technologically than we are, and probably more socially advanced. You're probably more spiritually advanced as well. So if anybody knew what the true religion is on Earth, it would be you guys." He said, "There is no true religion on Earth." Steve said, "You can't just leave me hanging like that, and could you explain it a little more?" He said, "No, that's the end of the questions, and we've probably told you too much anyway." As they were leaving the ship, the being put his hand on his shoulder and said, "Wait, I'd like to talk to you some more." Steve then stopped and immediately went unconscious, and the next thing he remembered was standing in the parking lot feeling cold and looking at the ship. The leader was standing in the doorway of the ship and was silhouetted from the light behind him. He remembers seeing these big black eyes staring at him, and it felt like extreme and unconditional love. Then Steve's face felt wet, and he realized that he'd been crying, and wondered what he'd said to him that made him cry. It was like trying to recall a beautiful dream that you wake up from and can't get back to.